Good morning and welcome to the Core Connection. I'm Mira Rubin here with you on Enlightened World Network. And today's topic is heresy. We generally hear the word or know of the word in the context of religious beliefs, but heresy. Good morning, Rosalind. Welcome. So good to have you here with us this morning, and welcome also to everybody else who's joining us. Today we're talking about heresy. Really, heresy is anything that defies conventional belief or doctrine. And so we're going to look at the value of heresy and the need for it in our current moment of challenge in human history. So it should be a fun conversation. And before we get started, let's take a minute or two to get present. So let's take a deep breath in through your nose and hold it. And imagine clean, crisp oxygen flooding your lungs, flowing into your bloodstream, nourishing all your cells, all your organs, bringing vital life energy to your body and being. And as you exhale any tension, stress, negativity, fatigue. And now let's take another deep breath in through your nose and hold it. This time, imagine brilliant, bright light, lighting you up from the inside out, illuminating, electrifying, and energizing all your molecules, your electrons, your cells, your organs, and creating this brilliant beam of light and energy from your heart out into the world. And as you exhale any remaining tension, stress, negativity, and fatigue. And now let's press our palms together, vigorously rub your hands together to feel all that tickling, the tingling, the friction, the temperature, the motion, all of those sensations, and allow them to bring you present right here, right now, into this remarkable physical form that enables you to experience life. Welcome, welcome, welcome. So, heresy. How this topic arose was in a conversation yesterday with a client, and I said something. I said, I know that's heresy, and they looked up the word, and what heresy means is it's usually used in a religious context, but what it actually has its origins in the word or in the concept of choice, and as related particularly to thought, to be choosing what to think to. And so that conversation led me to this notion of consciousness around thought, like being conscious about the thoughts that we think rather than what Carol Sanford calls thoughting. In other words, just adopting existing thoughts and parroting them or replicating those thoughts rather than actually coming to new thought, to engaging in the true act of thought, which is by its own nature generative. And so in this time, in this world that we are inhabiting and in play with, that we are a part of, there are so many challenges that are unprecedented that we are called upon to reconceptualize so many things. We've gotten, historically, humans have gotten so much of it wrong. Not all humans, but like popular culture has gotten so much of it, I'll say, wrong, in that the results of or the consequences of our actions have put our our Mama Earth and our all the living creatures upon it, including ourselves, in great jeopardy. And so we get to come up with different ways of being and thinking that are not necessarily aligned with the conventions of thought that have existed for centuries, and maybe harken back to schools of thought that have been here for millennia instead. So it's an interesting thing to consider that heretics have been burned and tortured and imprisoned, people with new ideas and or ideas that defy the convention. And when we look at how change is initiated, oftentimes the people who are bringing forth these new ideas are reviled and marginalized and sometimes literally tortured and killed. And what happens is that over time, these new ideas, after being so aggressively and often violently rejected, gain some traction and can be considered as possible realities, and then eventually become the standard, the norm. So I'm thinking in the moment of the world being flat, and how the world was flat for a very long time, and the notion that the world was not flat was not well received, or the notion that the earth was not the center of the universe was not well received. And heretics were, it was heretical to posit that notion that perhaps the sun was the center of our solar system. And I think that we're experiencing the kind of upheaval that occurs with new notions of existence. It's so fascinating how people will defend their notion of reality and truth with violence, with a refusal to entertain other possibilities, that the notion that reality is different than we believe it to be engenders all kinds of very reactionary response from people. It's so interesting. There's I'm trying to remember what it's called. There's a wonderful series on Netflix called The Ancient Apocalypse. That's what it is. If you have a chance to check it out, it's awesome. And it's talking about it within defensible scientific evidentiary terms. It's talking about a different notion of our history, and that humans have been around a whole lot longer than our standard archaeology purports. And so the person, it's Graham Wilcox, I believe is his name, has been studying this for years and years, has found all kinds of evidence, and he's not an archaeologist by training. And the archaeologists and the anthropologists are enraged at his theories and his boldness, and have done all been trying to debunk his information for very, very, very aggressively, like really sort of trying to defame him and marginalize his information, and him personally, right? Calling him a charlatan and all kinds of other name calling going on. And it's so interesting because people become so invested in what they think they know, right? We become really attached to our ideas. And here are all these people who have spent careers and lifetimes doing all this work based in a convention. And then when information comes forward that challenges that convention, they feel threatened because their life work is then challenged. So it's very fascinating. So Rosalind says, Netflix series, Ancient Apocalypse. What was the first evidence of civilization? It's such a good series. I really, really recommend it. If for no other reason than it will stretch your mind. And he makes a very compelling case. And it's not, it's so interesting how we reject things as fringe science. There's another physicist, let me think, what is his name? Nassim Haramein, who has been working for a long time on unified field theory. And he's not alone in that. But he also has been criticized as a charlatan. As good morning, Robin, welcome. It's so good to have you here this morning. We're talking about heresy and how heresy in its original definition is kind of related to free thought, like new thought, perhaps creative thought that defies the convention. And I think that what we're seeing at this moment in time is a huge disruption of the conventions, because and a necessary one. It doesn't mean that all new ideas are true or valid, but it also doesn't mean that all conventions are true or valid. And we so desperately need new ways of thinking, new ways of approaching the challenges that we're facing, because clearly our conventions of thought and propriety are not adequate to address the emergency that we are globally facing on this planet. And so one of the new paradigms that is, it's not new, one of the ancient paradigms that is finally gaining traction is that of the planet and the galaxies and the solar systems being alive and intelligent. and not intelligent like our thinking intelligent, but intelligent in terms of a living system that adapts and evolves and seems to have its own I'm going to say animation, meaning that it's driven from within itself somehow, like the animated universe. So good morning, Bernadette. Welcome. It's great to have you here this morning. We're talking about heresy, and heresy being choice in thought, original thought, awareness, evolutionary thought, and how new thought, new concepts, new paradigms are often received with great hostility and perceived as a threat to the status quo. And they are. And that's what we need now, is thought that is a challenge to the status quo, because the status quo is not adequate for the challenges that we're facing. We need to be coming up with new ways of interacting and with our environment, with each other. Bernadette says change can be good. Yes, 100% change can be good. And change brings with it upheaval, even when it's good change, because it means the dissolution or the decay of existing systems, right? So there's some degree of chaos that is part of change, that's a necessary part of change. And I know I've mentioned this before, but there's a Buckminster Fuller quote talking about, don't try to change existing systems, create a new system that essentially is more compelling, more effective, that makes the old system obsolete, rather than trying to make corrective measures to fix the old. Let's generate something that's more effective, that just displaces the old. But meantime, the old doesn't go down without a fight. And we're seeing that with the fossil fuel industry. You know, in this moment when we know that our very survival on this planet is threatened by pollution, by eco-destruction. I'm not even going to talk about climate change, but by destroying our natural environment, we are still trying to expand our fossil fuel industry. Where we know that the fossil fuel industry is responsible for so much devastation on this planet. It's still in its and our governments are supporting it, you know, supporting further excavation, tar sands, fracking, pipelines. You know, our governments are supporting it, even in the face of the emergency that we are facing globally. And so it's not going down without a fight, so to speak. You know, this, and there's such a deep clinging to existing structures and infrastructures and money minting structures as well, right? So there's so much money tied into the fossil fuel industry. We have been under this mass hypnosis that tells us that that's our only way forward. And to talk about ending that in many arenas is considered heretical. So Rosalind says, with death, the old form dies. how do we retain or even determine what part of the old form is knowledge that pertains to the new form of being? Yeah, so that's a really good question, Rosalind. It's sort of, do we throw out the baby with the bathwater question, right? Where just because we need change, does that mean that everything that currently exists doesn't work or needs to be expunged in some way or another? And the answer is no. Look at, oh my gosh, I said expunged, and it made me think about this book burning insanity that's going on, or book banning insanity. It's like, are you kidding me? The books are being banned by the same people that didn't want people blocked on Twitter or Facebook, right? The people that were campaigning for free speech, right, on social media, even when that speech was exceedingly toxic. And then they're banning books. We live in such an upside down world. It's craziness, right? So Bernadette says, I've never understood why countries don't take the best of other parts of the world and implement the best of everywhere. Yeah, well, that's a great question, Bernadette. And also the question is, what's best and for whom, right? Because there are different factions that have very different ideas about what's best, and it's often based on what's best for the top 1% or what's best for a certain coalition, right? So it's such an interesting conversation, this notion of the notion of free speech is a really interesting thing. I recognize that, like, it is against the law to yell fire in a closed environment if there's not a fire, right? It is against the law, as far as I understand anyway, because it is just horribly disruptive. So the banning of people on social media, I'm no fan of our ex-president at all. And I also question that they were banned on social media, because as we're seeing this obstructions to freedom of speech, it's a very, very, very slippery slope, right? It's like, who gets to decide what can be censored? And we saw a lot of that censoring around information around in the pandemic too. So Bernadette says, then best becomes an opinion only. Well, best is based on criteria, right? And who establishes the criteria? If we look at best, look at history, the history that we have been entrained into in our country, for the most part, was considered best by old white men, right? And as a result, whole factions of society were excluded from that history. It's not like it was truth, right? It was fractional. And what do they say? History belongs to the victors. So the vantage point from which that history was written was a very specific vantage point, wasn't it? And now, as we're incorporating the stories of other peoples within that history, we are gaining a very different perspective. Columbus goes from being a hero to being someone who was a vehicle of something of a genocide, right? It's very, very interesting how I guess we get to look at what's opinion and what's truth, and is there a way to transcend opinion? I don't know. I really truly don't know. And the notion of like moving from a mechanistic universal model to a model of a living universe is a very, very different paradigm. And it has originally, well, not originally, but within the Descartesian mechanistic model of the world, when people were talking about the world being alive and a living system, that was heresy, and people were dismissed as being crazies. You know, it's kind of like where environmentalists today, kids are being dismissed as being snowflakes. You know, that unrealistic considerations. So there are many young heretics that are challenging the status quo and receiving all kinds of backlash for it, as well as support. And there will be a time when we look back at this time that we, you know, the way that we have treated the planet and other life forms and each other, and look at how barbaric these times have been. I believe that. I don't know if I'll live to see it, but I believe that we will have the opportunity to look back with that kind of recognition. Anyway, that's it for today. Pretty intense musings and an encouragement to source that new thought, to be willing to be a heretic. In other words, to choose your thought rather than to just live within the assumed paradigms, to challenge the existing norms, to find a greater alignment with what might actually be life affirming. So with that, I'm Mira Rubin. This is the Core Connection, and I go live here each weekday morning on the Enlightened World Network Facebook page and YouTube channel at 9 a.m. Eastern. And I invite you to check out the other awesome programming on Enlightened World Network and Enlightened World Living. And I'm so grateful to you for your willingness to engage in these conversations and to really generate new thought and create new potentials. So with that, until next time, so much love to you.